Hello all. This week we are going to be talking about progressives and public welfare. Uh, what was so progressive about the progressive movement? Why did the country follow private charity with public welfare? And that's what we're going to look at. Is it's a really big switch from private charities to looking at a much more public welfare system. Okay, so this week we're going to continue to see significant changes in the U.S. Um, and I know that this is kind of a repeat as we talk about it, but these are continued growths and continued changes. So changes described in the previous lectures intensified. Manufacturing increased in the U.S. and surpassed Europe. Between 1899 and 1929, manufacturing increased 273%. Um, and I'm sure for most of you and for myself, that's a number that's just like, wow, hard to picture how much growth we see in that area. Inventions and innovations, managerial skills, advancements, and mechanization. So, during this period, we're going to see a lot of changes. A lot of them are going to be inventions and innovations, things that'll improve textile and improve sewing. But some other things are new ways to lay out factories and new scientific measurements for managerial styles. Those also start to come about and really increase industrialization. A demand for increased labor was met by an influx of rural Americans and European immigrants. So Rule 1900 was 40% of the population lived in cities. By 1930, 56% of the population lived in cities, and that's both white and black. Immigration, 20 million immigrants between 1900 and 1915. 13% of the American population at this time was immigrants. 1 in 7 Americans was an immigrant. Immigrants and their children equal 1/3 of the population. So as you can see, immigration and the increase in urban areas was huge during the early 20th century. Cities become more commercial, industrial, and political. Urban living was a strange experience for both rural Americans and the immigrants. Political bosses and machines sought to control allegiance for favors, jobs, and contracts. So, this is going to go in the category of I hope that you have some good background, and if not, let me know and I can recommend some sources. But this is often called the Gilded Age for the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And what that means is gilded actually means covered in gold. And not valuable underneath. So that's the way this was seen. Is there was on the surface a lot of prosperity, but underneath there was a lot of corruption and a lot of urban issues. Um, Political machines were quasi-social welfare. They opposed some social reform movements because they'd lose their power base. And basically what that means is they opposed these social welfare movements because that's how they got power with immigrants and working class, is they were able to essentially buy votes by helping people get jobs, get places to live, especially immigrants who are new to this country and may not speak the language. Um, there's an economic collapse in 1893. It was not as grave as the one, clearly we'll discuss the Great Depression in 1930, but it was one of the worst up until that point in American history. Hardships for 4 million unemployed prompted a collective response, especially from the laborers. The American Federation of Labor became a dominant force. 1886, the Alliance of Skilled Workers in Crafts. Social reform has been based on individualistic society was no longer sufficient in a corporate universe. Desperate citizens were looking for government action. And we're going to see a very similar response in 1930, and we're going to again see it start and be unable to be maintained by private charities and move to a public government, more group response. Okay, so progressives still saw a white Protestant culture as the optimal model and intended for immigrants to emulate it. So, we've talked a lot about private charities and how they very much enforced not only a white Protestant, but a very middle class culture along with their offers of assistance. And we're going to continue to see that with the progressives, although again, the progressives are going to be a little more trained and a little more scientific. Multiple groups endeavored to address these challenges. Charity organizations, settlement houses, business associations, and the Socialist Party, which during this time period experiences probably its biggest growth, even I would say maybe even bigger than it will during the Great Depression, and it becomes an alternative to the Democratic and the Republicans. Political activity partnered with economic and social reform, regulate business through the Hepburn Act, in 1906. It regulated railroad rates and telephone and telegraph companies. The Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890. It was used in 1911 to stop the single consolidation of the railroads. The Food and Drug Administration Act of 1906, which monitored butchering and food production. And just a little background, because I always think that that's a fascinating act, is that one of the things you'll see on my slide is the cover for the book The Jungle. And Upton Sinclair actually intended originally to write kind of a socialist treaty where he talked about the poor treatment of the working class in these kind of factories. But what a lot of people actually took away from it was how horrific our food was prepared, and that is actually part of what spurs the Food and Drug Act and the continued food and drug reform as we move forward in the early 20th century. The 16th Amendment in 1909 was income tax. The Federal Reserve Board in 1913 was banking reform. The Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914 safeguarded labor organizations to help make them stronger and it more possible for them to form. Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914 oversees business methods to ensure fair competition. And then eventually in 1920, the 19th Amendment passes, which is women's suffrage. As you can see, the progressives were very focused on the idea of government and public intervention. While yes, the settlement houses are more private, there's a lot of progressive legislation that goes through from the late 19th century to the early 20th century. There's more public welfare movements, changes in the public administration of institutions. Local overseer of the poor was changed to local and county administrators. Movement towards professional social work, which we kind of talked about previously. A shift from voluntary movement to a philanthropic movement. Leaders began to call for government action. Children continue to be a serious concern during this period. In 1909, the White House Conference on Dependent Children, which initiated by James West, a Washington lawyer who had been raised as an orphan in an institution. It acknowledged that child welfare was a national concern, not a local one, and afforded social work a prominent position. It recommended home rather than institutional care. So you can see that's again a switch in the kind of relief we're talking about. Development of adoption agencies and increased use of the boarding system for children unsuitable for adoption. And then cottage rather than congregate living in institutional settings. So not in big groups as much as smaller units that are going to more mimic the family unit. And inspection of child care facilities that already exist. It's held every 10 years, and it was last hosted by the Clintons in 1996. The U.S. Children's Bureau was established in 1912. It moved from the Department of Commerce to Labor to Health, Education and Welfare, to Health and Human Services. The justification, there were women lobbying for it. You're going to see a really increased female presence in the progressive movement. I think that, that's not to deny by any stretch the male participation, because there are some big names like Theodore Roosevelt and others who are really important and integral, but because so many of these are domestic issues, we're talking about children and the home and putting food on the table, and these are really what are considered still kind of women's issues. So they're going to really come to the forefront. They were enraged when the government approved large-scale federal campaigns against boll weevils that were decimating the cotton crops. The Bureau of Animal Husbandry, in the Agricultural Department had 1,000 employees and an annual appropriation of $1.25 million. It spent more money researching animals than they did the children's developmental needs. So that's what women were lobbying for, is that, we need to now invest some time, not just into animals and agriculture, but into the growth of our children. Support in parent-teacher groups, unions, public health workers, social workers, and civic organizations. And one note I'll make about unions too. Another reason they support the reduction of child labor is because child laborers are often paid less, and a grown man might not get that job at a living wage if it's given to a child. So it not only were they clearly concerned about protecting children, but they were also protecting their own workers in the process. Their opposition claimed proponents were working under the orders from European socialists and communists, claimed the goal was to use agencies to regulate the nation's youth. So I'm going to say that anytime we see public welfare, there's going to be a discussion of socialism and communism, because clearly there are concerns about those situations. The role was a research agency. It had no administrative power. It's the central source of information about welfare of children and their families, and it represented the government's acknowledgement of its responsibility to protect children. And I think that might be the most important, because that's what we're talking about when we talk about public welfare. We're not only acknowledging that there's a problem, but we're also acknowledging that the government has some responsibility to deal with the problem. Okay, then we have the Shepard-Towner Act of 1918. It's known as the Infancy and Maternity Act. Maternal death was higher than any other leading nation in the world, which clearly equals more orphans and situation for us to deal with. Aids state with maternal and child health facilities, especially in rural areas, promote public health, nursing, and education. Outpatient clinics, the inspection of maternity homes. Again, the opposition was concerns about socialism, communism, and the nationalization of the nation's youth. There's a lot of concern, in opposition that the goal is to kind of indoctrinate young children who may not have solid ideas about capitalism with these ideas of socialism and communism. Medical doctors launched well-financed campaigns. The effectiveness of this was it received $1.25 million for 5 years. It was extended to 1929. It established nearly 3,000 child and maternal health centers. It strengthened state health departments. Infant and mortality rates dropped significantly in its brief life. It demised in 1929 because it did not have the support of President Hoover. And that's not to say he didn't support any public welfare programs, but he did not support this one. Male physicians also funded campaigns to wrest control from women-run clinics. The economy then collapses in 1929, and Congress did not renew its funds. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about working conditions. Some of the issues, we've already discussed child labor. In 1900, 18% of children between 10 and 15 worked. The average was lower in the north and higher in the south. It's only 3% in the north and 24% in the south. The working day was, the average working day was 11 hours. The first legislation for women to work 10 hours. The battle shifted to an 8-hour, a 6-day work week, and organized labor obtained the 8-hour work day. Unorganized labor still worked um, a longer workday. Um, Welfare capitalism becomes a new concept during this period as unions start to take a stronger hold. Um, they Capitalists fought back with ideas of welfare capitalism. So what they would do is offer benefits to the employees, unemployment and pension benefits, company homes and stores, libraries, recreational facilities, profit sharing, group life and health insurance policies. They're intended to provide social welfare to the employees, but also, especially when we're talking about welfare capitalism, we're talking about social control because they want to keep out unions and other things that they may want to socially control, like alcohol, because they believed it was not good for working men to drink. Clearly their concern was whether it would affect their job performance. Effort to stem the rise of unions. Critics pointed out the system denied workers vested rights, so anyone dismissed could lose all that benefits and protection. Also anyone injured. Those were some of the things that labor unions were focused on protecting workers from. And it died out during the Depression, although you can still see remnants of it in things like benefits that companies offer, and sometimes even things like company picnics and things like that are paid for by the company. Prohibition came about in 1919. It was the 18th Amendment. Alcohol seemed to be the root of many problems and poverty. That's how a lot of people felt at the beginning of the 20th century. It seemed to be just a destroying force in families. We've talked a lot about concerns from previous private charities, friendly visitors, and other groups that were concerned about alcohol in the home and what it meant. Alcohol was associated with immigrants and burgeoning urban population. Irish were associated with the beer and ale in the pubs. Germans were associated with beer and beer gardens, and Italians with wine in their homes. Some of the leadership of this movement was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, progressives who wanted to reform the city areas, and Methodist and Baptist clergy. They made it illegal to make, sell, or transport alcohol. The middle class virtually ignored the law and continued to drink socially. It even became fashionable to ignore the law, and I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the idea of speakeasies and flappers, which are clear popular social examples of how not many people really paid much attention to Prohibition, especially if you were in the middle class and you were able to access it. And then the last slide, the last point I want to focus on is a suffrage. 1919. Okay, and that's the 19th Amendment. Women had been advocating actively for the right to vote since the end of the Civil War. And even before that, I would say, because the first call for a woman's right to vote is in 1848 in the Seneca Falls Convention, which is the first women's rights convention in America. There were divergent strategies that proved to be ineffective, but the National American Women's Suffrage Association, later which becomes the League of Women Voters, worked with other groups, including the YWCA and the National Women's Trade Union League, to kind of form a coalition that would be the thing that was finally successful in getting women the right to vote. They were concerned about social justice for women in general, and they capitalized on women's efforts during World War I and gained President Wilson's support. And that was really important, because originally President Wilson was not sure he supported women's right to vote. But then World War I comes along, and he really needed women's support. People were not sure they wanted to get involved in an international conflict. it gave them the much sought after political voice that they had been lacking since the founding of our country. So we covered a lot of topics in today's lecture, and you can check out some great resources in my reference slide. Remember that that's where all these pictures and the information comes from, is these sources. And you know, some of them are, if you're interested in child labor or child welfare, there's a lot about the Children's Bureau this lecture, and a lot of basic timelines which can give you a really good start. You guys have a great day.